women have more disability than men. That is, it affects women more severely, functionally, than it affects men when it occurs. And actually, that's true in rheumatoid arthritis as well. If you measure the amount of damage to the joints in rheumatoid arthritis, women have more functional loss than men. And we don't really understand, and it's a very important issue to understand why, but we don't really understand why women suffer more from a functional loss than men do, even though the damage is the same that you can measure. So the prevalence of the disease now, currently, in Western Europe, it is a common disease. It varies between 0.2 and 1.4%. The actual prevalence of ankylosing spondylitis in the USA is unknown, but may be between 0.3 and 1.3 of adults over the age of 25, and it's probably greater than rheumatoid arthritis. One of the reasons why it's greater than rheumatoid arthritis is that the prevalence of rheumatoid arthritis today is actually declining. It's actually declining. Do any of you have a guess as to why the prevalence of rheumatoid arthritis today is declining? Anybody want to guess? Why?
Because it's more properly diagnosed as a disease.
Oh, that's a sneaky way of looking. So it's earlier diagnosed, right? Or you diagnose less severe forms?
No, actually, I think a lot of times, like with spondylitis, we're diagnosed with RA or something like that, and it's not accurate.
So you're misdiagnosed. Okay, that's one reason. He'll have to turn it on. I must have said something. I'm being carried out of here.
Sorry, we're having a slight technical.
If you think of diseases as a genetic predisposition and an environmental trigger, and that's your model, and look at rheumatoid arthritis, and I'm telling you it's declining. The genetics don't change. So why is it declining? Something in the environment. All right? Now, I'm not going to... What is it in the environment today that people are doing less of that is probably the most important trigger for the onset of rheumatoid arthritis in the modern world? It is cigarette smoking. Absolutely. Yeah. And you can parallel the decline in the incidence and severity of rheumatoid arthritis with the decline in cigarette smoking. Okay? So all of these diseases have a relationship between genes and environment. We don't know what the trigger is for ankylosing spondylitis, which has a very high genetic component. We still don't know what the trigger is. People are looking for it. Now, let's go on. How do you make a reliable early diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis? I talked to you about classification and diagnosis. Classification is not a way to make a diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis using classification criteria. As physicians, we often make diagnoses sometimes before we actually know. And that is because it may not be safe to fail to make a diagnosis. So we might want to treat before patients meet certain criteria. So often we make a diagnosis, what we call a presumptive diagnosis, because if we missed something, we'd be in bad shape. So that's what we do as physicians. We sometimes overdiagnose or diagnose a little bit early before patients fulfill these classification criteria. It's too late to make a diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis when patients fulfill classification criteria because they've already achieved damage to their joints. And we want to make a diagnosis before they fulfill classification criteria. And that's the point I want to make. So the key to make a diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis is to understand what is inflammatory back pain. How do you tell the difference between mechanical back pain and inflammatory back pain? So a literature review was done by our colleagues in Europe to understand the difference between inflammatory back pain and mechanical back pain. Inflammatory back pain is back pain that awakens you in the middle of the night that improves with exercise and walking throughout the day, that's worse in the morning, associated with morning stiffness, and sometimes is alternating from buttock to buttock. That's inflammatory back pain. Mechanical back pain is back pain that goes away when you get in bed at night, doesn't usually awaken you, doesn't usually. And as the day goes on, it actually gets worse. Kind of makes sense, right? And so those are basic differences between mechanical and inflammatory back pain. So if you go to any back pain population, now you're learning a little clinical epidemiology now. If you go to any back pain clinic or any collection of people that show up with back pain, if you put a sign up, do you have back pain? Everybody come over here. And you actually survey them, 5% of people will have ankylosing spondylitis. 5% in any back pain population. Whereas in the no back pain population, people walking out on the street, remember, it's 0.3 to 1.3%. So you've enriched the population now of the possible diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis by pulling people in with back pain. Then if you take those back pain people and decide and look at them and see which ones have inflammatory back pain, that 5% figure turns out to be 14 or 15%. And then if you take those with inflammatory back pain and do an HLA-B27 test on them, or ask them a bunch of other questions, or do an MRI of their sacroiliac joints, then you increase the probability to 70, 80, or 90% of making a diagnosis. And that's what we do as physicians. That's all we do. You guys figured it out. I told you, we can quit. You can do this job. Right? All you need to do to be a doctor is say, that's very interesting. You know? That's what I told them. That's all. And learn this stuff. Learn these algorithms. And then you're a doctor. That's it, if you really want to be. So that's what is done here, actually. This is what the doctors do. They take the 5% population that have back pain, apply the inflammatory back pain rule. That likelihood ratio is 3.1 times 5%, so that gets 15%. And then they check for all these other things, and then they do an HLA-B27 test. It's really pretty easy, and you pay all that money. There's nothing to it. And this is what they do. They take the population, cull it out for inflammatory back pain, yes, 14%, apply the B27 test, ask these questions, and you got the diagnosis. Looks easy. In most cases, it is. But in a lot of cases, it isn't. So what is inflammatory back pain? If you use inflammatory back pain as a criteria, what the Europeans did this several years ago, they took a population of definite AS patients and non-AS back pain control and asked the question, how often does inflammatory back pain occur in either of these two populations? And can we come up with a diagnostic algorithm? And so they took the criteria that I mentioned, morning stiffness, improvement with exercises, awakening in the second half of the night, alternating buttock pain. And inflammatory back pain was present with a sensitivity of 70% and a specificity of 81% in the AS patients compared to the control group. So inflammatory back pain is a pretty good way of telling the difference between AS and non-AS back pain. B27 is a good test, but with the B27 alone, you only get 30% probability. And MRI is a good test also, but there are some problems with using MRI to make a diagnosis. So diagnosing it, is it easy or is it not? If patients present with classic changes in their sacroiliac joints on X-ray, it's a piece of cake. It's easy. There's nothing else that does that. However, what what X-rays do you use? What kind of X-rays? Who should do them? Who should interpret them? What about the location of symptoms? What about people that have neck pain and thoracic spine pain and not just low back pain? How do you deal with that issue? Well, it's not always as easy as I make it out to be. For example, here's a patient I saw not that long ago. I mean, anybody could diagnose sacroiliitis in this case, right? Look at this. The joints are eroded. There's all this thickening of bone. You see this? Okay, that's classic. My grandmother could make the diagnosis of ankylosing. My grandmother's a radiologist. When I say, but anybody could do this, all right? But look about this case. Here's a case with relatively normal-looking sacroiliac joints. Remember what this looked like compared to this one? Okay, look at these joints here and compare them to these here. All right, you see the difference. He did an MRI, and boom, look at this. Look at this inflammation here in this sacroiliac joint with a normal appearing joint on X-ray. So it's not easy often. You can have a normal X-ray, but you can have inflammation on MRI. I don't want to get into how MRI is different from an X-ray. Most of you probably know this. It's a different technique. It measures different things. So, again, it's not often easy to make a diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis. So, summary to where we are now. Classification criteria are not diagnostic criteria. Ankylosing spondylitis may be more common than you think, and this is certainly true in Europe. The recognition of inflammatory back pain helps you lead to a diagnostic algorithm. But we don't know certain things. When does the disease begin? Is back pain or inflammation in the SI joints the only place where it starts? And do we really understand the pathogenesis of ankylosing spondylitis? Now, the genetic epidemiology is going to help us. We know it's a very highly genetically associated disease. If you look at the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins, remember, fraternal twins are just like brothers and sisters, any other brothers and sisters, whereas identical twins are identical genetically. And you look at a family, and you'll see that identical twin concordance is 63% compared to 23% concordance in the non-identical twins. So there's a huge genetic component to the disease. And the risk of ankylosing spondylitis in a sibling of somebody that has the disease who's B27 positive, okay, is very high compared to the 5% risk in a B27 positive in the person in the community. And B27 is located on chromosome 6. It's the major locus, but there's now newly discovered genes on other chromosomes, and the SAA and ourselves have been involved in this gene hunt for other genes associated with ankylosing spondylitis, and I'll show you some of that data as we go forward. Now, uveitis, iritis. How many in the room have had this condition? Wow. That's about 40% of the people with ankylosing spondylitis, and I counted, that's exactly 40%. It turns out that over a lifetime, 40% of patients with AS develop iritis. It always occurs just in one eye or the other eye. And Jim Rosenbaum can't figure out for the life of him why it should only occur in one eye or flip-flop from one eye to another. He still can't figure it out. And it's a very important association because Jim Rosenbaum has discovered a specific gene that's associated with with iritis that's associated with ankylosing spondylitis. That's not a gene associated with ankylosing spondylitis itself, which is a clue to the fact that there are other genes involved, perhaps associated with other manifestations of ankylosing spondylitis. And this is his genome-wide scan that he published, showing you that here on chromosome 6, where B27 is, those people with anterior uveitis and those people with spondylitis without it have the same gene. But there's a hit on chromosome 9 only in patients or SIB pairs with anterior uveitis. So there's a new gene that's specific for anterior uveitis, which is really interesting. So are there other genes associated with other aspects of ankylosing spondylitis? Well, that's what we're looking for at the present time. So here is the old-fashioned view of spondylitis, ankylosing spondylitis, is that there was a long period of time of back pain, and then at some point, X-ray changes take place, and you get a diagnosis, which was really when you fulfill classification criteria of radiographic sacroiliitis. This is the old-fashioned way. This is the new-fashioned way of looking at the disease, is that there's a genetic predisposition, there's an environmental trigger which we don't know what it is, there's the onset of symptoms which take place for a long period of time before patients get X-ray changes. So this is our new paradigm of the disease over time. Can the discovery of new genes help us diagnose ankylosing spondylitis early? Yes, they can. This is the Wellcome Trust Gene Hunters that all of you are participating in, probably, who contributed your blood to these gene testing that's been going on now for some time in your association with the SAA. This was a study that was just published last year of ankylosing spondylitis, a number of other diseases that are thought to have a genetic predisposition compared to a huge control group. And this is the genome-wide scan of these diseases, showing you here in chromosome 5, there's a big hit in ankylosing spondylitis, and the two new genes that have been discovered are the IL-27R and the ARTS1 genes, which you probably heard about if you read the website and you read Spondylitis Plus and you read other things, that these are the two new genes that are discovered. They're not on chromosome 6, they're on other chromosomes. So how do these two new genes help us diagnose ankylosing spondylitis? Well, here's how they do it. Now, most of you up to this point would be able to figure out what I'm going to show you on this